Welcome all to the hunt, and today's target shall be the Barioth, the frozen wyvern. Before we start this episode by talking about the obvious, which is the Barioth, the monster himself, which is what this series is about, let's talk about the new changes that's coming from boys, because this series has been on hiatus for quite some time, and unfortunately it was mostly due to technical difficulties. I won't say that I didn't back my saves up, but I didn't back my stuff up, and thus it just kind of backed me up into the corner for a little bit, and that was very unfortunate. As we come to this is where we start seeing if you're gonna see a few changes in this style of editing I'm doing right now. Because since we're actually into a decent chunk, well, not a decent chunk, but we're somewhat forward in the progression to Iceborne story and monster progression, you will see a pretty big change as to how these episodes play out. First of all, what you will be seeing will only be the most successful or more interesting hunts that we will have. Not to say that everyone will be successful, as we previously saw in the Devil Joe, Behemoth, Little Nostra episode, but since Barioth marks what I would call the first major difficulty spike in Iceborne, and it's mostly attributed due to the new skeletons that you will find in most or mid-tier monsters that you will find in Iceborne. Not all of them, obviously, but a good chunk of them. You will see a lot of changes coming up towards it. And so, the main changes that you will see is not only that you will find the most successful or more interesting hunts in the edit, they will also be shortened by a decent amount, only for, viewer enjoyment time. So, I will be speaking more so into how the best way to find him, what's their research like, what's their numbers like, since I feel like most people would be interested in those kinds of maths, and also making sure that the game, this series becomes a little more interesting and a little more introspective as to how best it is to appreciate these monsters and how to fight it more effectively would be the better way to say this. So, let's start by talking about Barioth himself, his design, what he looks like, how he behaves, and all that. So he's clearly inspired by Sabertooth. He was clearly designed with Sabertooth cat in mind, and he acts a lot like a tiger. Like, if you look at his stance, his skeleton, it just looks a lot like that. He's very fierce, incredibly aggressive, and obviously you need to be very, very, very attuned while you're playing against it. Otherwise, you will see that you will be having loads of problem with that. He does have a few interesting cases in his design. For me, the back plates, they mostly look like crocodile scales, if anything. You could attribute that to a lot of lizards, I assume, or a lot of reptiles in the animal kingdom, but even so. I will say, Barioth is so interesting because he has a very defined trait, which is Sabertooth cat. And the rest is just kind of very fiction-y, and I'm not sure I like that as much as the realism, well, quote-unquote realistic approach design that the most of the base world design has got. So the Legiana, the Olgarin, they all look fairly realistic. Fairly! This is still a fictional game, by the way. I'm not attributing everything to that, but I'm just saying. And you know what? He looks fairly deadly for it, I'm gonna give him that. He looks very aggressive, but even so, he's still a fairly mid-tier monster, so he can be easily approached. If you come in with the right weapons and armor, he'll be substantially easier. With that said, sometimes you just don't have that kind of luxury. He has so many white egg boxes that can really give you a lot of problem, and unfortunately, that kind of shit happens. A lot of hyper armor. And not to tune my own horn here, but this guy kicked my ass. How much, you ask? This was a small sample of death I've accumulated while doing this hunt. Again, this is where my 1 hour time limit mostly comes into effect when it comes to me and recording these videos. I feel like if I could get a lot of practice through these monsters in particular, I would be substantially better. But sometimes you gotta deal with the cards that you were given. The main tactics that I would ask everybody, well, not ask everybody, but mostly recommend for everybody, is if you're fighting him in the arena, he isn't immediately aggressive to you. So probably the best way to start off the fight is significantly by just taking a stone, shooting at the ground, distracting him so you can clutch call his face, and then you can just smack him around until he's in a better position where you can wall bang him. And that is effectively what I believe to be the best way to start pretty much a large portion of the fight that you will see in later monsters in Iceborne. Of course, we will go on to later and more difficult fights as we go along, and thank God we're not there yet. So let's just say that it's a really good tactic that you can use for most monsters, most base Iceborne monsters, and you should use it to the best of your abilities. When it comes to Barioth itself, again, like I said, he's extremely aggressive, but there is a way to counteract it. Most monsters with this new skeletal form that you will see, like in the Barioth, which we will see in the Nagakuga, which we will see in the Tigrex, are usually fairly weak when you stay up close. The most safe zone-ish, relative safe zone that you can have with Barioth is, frankly enough, not his hind legs, which I would consider that for most of the monsters, because he has ways to knock you off, and his tail has close activation boxes when he does a tail swipe or anything like that. So honestly, I think the safest zone he could potentially be is by the side of his front legs. He hops a lot in front of you and he will displace himself quite a bit, as you see right now. But he doesn't have a lot of direct moves that covers his front limbs straight away. He has things that can knock you off, but it's nothing that a good repositioning can do to you. And if you're playing a highly reactive weapon like the longsword, it just makes it all the easier, because counter hitboxes, especially for longsword, not to say that they're broken, but they're fairly long. It can be easier to deal with. And it just gives you a lot of leg room to go around this fight. Again, the head is probably, of course, in front of the head is probably the deadliest space you can be. But surprisingly enough, Barioth is pretty ridiculously strong at long range too. And it's mostly because he has both a few, he has one particular projectile ability, which would be, while most people wouldn't stay far away from him, which, then again, he only has one projectile he's using right now. But the main reason why you don't want to stay far from the Barioth is mostly because of the gap closer that he has. His pounce attack that you see right now is a huge gap closer. There's a way to mitigate it, but he has a large gap closer that deals just humongous amount of damage, and if you're not ready to position yourself correctly, especially in its pounce attack, he will absolutely wreck you. And considering that this challenge, Naked Monster Hunter, is essentially a one-hit challenge, you gotta take those into account if you want to survive as long as you want. Now, with that said, let's talk about the Barioth part and how to mitigate most of its efforts. His pounce attack, and actually most claw attacks that he uses, most abilities that he uses his front limb for, can be mitigated by breaking it, which is where we get into a lot of interesting scenarios. It's not something that we haven't seen in Bear's World, where breaking apart would mitigate some abilities, but it really comes to play in a lot of the Iceborne monsters, or at least are a lot more noticeable. As you will see in this fight in particular, every time the Barioth will go for a front limbs attack, his recovery animation will be different whether you've broken certain limbs or not. So say he goes for a right swing attack, where he tries to catch you with his right front limb. If his right arm is broken, his right claws are broken, you'll have a longer recovery animation than you would if it wasn't. And if you break both, if you break both claws as he goes for a pounce attack, you won't be staggered on the ground for a substantial amount of time. You'll actually fumble there for a little bit. And it's actually one of the easiest way to counteract the Barioth. It's a really effective way to nullify most of his abilities and just mobility potential, which does mean that he is incredibly hard to deal with when you are early on in the fight. So that is something you have to take into consideration, yes, but it's not undeniable and undoable to do that. Again, if you stay by the side in front of front limbs and you have a mostly reactive weapon, you can do that very easily. I'm playing dual blades here because I want a twitch fast weapon that I'm very comfortable with, and also can reposition myself super easily with, which I still believe to be one of the easiest way to approach this challenge on. I'm just saying. So, with that said, if you can't break the claws, how does it look like? Well, let's look at the charts real fast. Let's pull up his hit zone value, which, yes, I do believe that if you're planning on doing a Naked Monster Hunter challenge, a no armor challenge, a no charm challenge, any kind of that stuff, you need to look at the charts and knowing basically how you can deal the most effective amount of damage to the monster efficiently, fast, and without risk. So, if you look at it, he has an average, and I'm specifically looking at cutting damage here. You could look at elemental all day, but he's not anything particularly like unbelievable when it comes to elements, and since I'm playing mostly cutting weapon, I will look at that specifically, and that goes for every monster from now on. So when it comes to cutting damage, he has an average of 38 with the end looking fairly juicy at 65. So if he's either down or staggered like he is right now, of course going for the head is like top priority, but that goes for nearly every single monster. The back is at 30, which you will never get on top of the back unless you do especially a narrowbone move or like the dual blade, which is like the true demon spirit slash thing where you go down slope and then you can literally spin on his back and the spine of his tail, which, you know, that pretty much never happens anyway, so it's totally fine. The stomach is at a soft 38, which isn't too great, but it's still decent damage. The claws, if you stay by the side and, like I told you, stay by the side and close to him for the beginning of the fight, you'll have a 21, and when they're broken, they're at 25. You hit the wing itself, it's at 30, and the forelegs at 40. So there's a lot of different places where you can potentially hit him during the, if you're trying to hit the forelimbs. Of course, the forelegs are going to be better, but you need to strike them head on, which can be far more dangerous. So, again, stick by the side, hit the wings, hit the broken claws, if anything. If you have something like weakness X point in your build, which you shouldn't since this is a Naked Monster Hunter challenge, it's still a fair decent amount of damage. Since the hind legs are looking 25, and they're not that much safer, if you ask me, even worse in some scenarios. Again, going for the claws and getting some hits on the forelegs or even the wings for more potential damage is just better in general. The tail at 45 and the tail tip at 60, they're juicy. They really, really are, especially for cutting damage, because that goes for every cutting weapon. Honestly, the tail is super juicy for every weapon. I wouldn't go for the tail. It's kind of this weird scenarios where it lifts up in most animations, so it can be hard to hit and just in the hitboxes in general. As well as I find the tail to be extremely deceivingly long range, meaning that if you're trying to go for the tail, I think Barioth will punish you in more occasions than not with his tail swipes and just sweeping attack motion, where you get most scenarios where it either combos you into a full tail sweep, or it's just really hard to reach a tail to begin with. So unless you're directly on the back of the Barioth because he's distracted on something else, I don't think it's worth going for the tail that much. And honestly, again, I think the claws and forelegs are by far your best way to go. And that goes also for impact. Impact type of weapon. If you're really good at dodging edge movement and just knows the pattern of the monster very specifically, going for the head is of course going to be the best. But since we're talking about safe, consistent strategy, Barioth is just better general if you go the other way around. That's just my look at the subject. You be free to do that. And if there's ever a weapon to bring into this fight, it's going to be Fire Elemental. It doesn't do a lot, but it does enough to be substantial. Dragon and Thunder can be a thing too, but if you're going for not bow or not dual blades, you're gonna go with raw anyway, especially when it comes to this challenge. But since I'm using dual blades, please bring in fire, and please, 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 please aim it at the claws or the head, otherwise you will do no significant damage outside of that, and it's gonna be really, really, really damn sad. Basically, nothing else on his body takes as much damage as a claw, which again is why I'm saying it's probably the most effective way you could potentially deal damage to Barioth. Because again, Barioth is probably where Iceborne gets a lot tougher. It marks quite a heavy difficulty spike, and you should take that into consideration. With that said, it's not that it's undoable, it's just that it will take you some time to adapt. But with that done, this marks the end of the hunt. Not to say that I expected this one, but I was very happy to do so. Join us next time for another hunt.